Welcome back to Part 5 of Fly Fishing Hatches. I'm Raj Kletke. As I said in Part 4, we'll need some emergers and cripples before we can effectively fish the blue-winged olive's surface emergence hatch. So let's get started. First, you might ask, why do we need emergers? There's lots of rising fish. Isn't one of the flies we just tied in Part 4 enough? Sometimes one of them will be enough, but just as commonly, or even more commonly, you won't be getting as many strikes as you think you should be getting. Do you just change the surface fly or try something different? Well, blue-winged olives include numerous species, so there is some variation in emergences, but most have nymphs that rise to just under the surface and ride there at least briefly as they start to emerge. Watch the rise forms closely. Usually you'll see some rise forms that leave air bubbles, implying that they are taking flies off the surface. But many others will be only bulges, swirls, etc., without air bubbles. These trout are usually taking subsurface early emergers. Early emergers are both numerous and vulnerable in many blue-winged olive emergences, so it's not surprising that many trout prefer emergers. In fact, on flat water, I often do better with emergers, while in riffles, both my surface flies and subsurface flies seem to work. So we definitely need emergers. Let's add another rule of thumb and then tie some emergers. You've already seen rules of thumb 1 and 2. Let's add number 3. If you're not getting strikes with your surface fly, consider going subsurface with an early stage emerger. This applies to many other mayfly surface emergences also, but it's especially true for blue-winged olive emergences. My favorite for the small blue-winged olives is a WD-40, which I tie in hook sizes 18 to 24. It represents an early stage emerger. I use it both as a dropper and as a single fly, which I will explain later. While some use a straight hook, I usually use a curved hook. As you can see, I've already tied in a tail of a barred feather. Often I use dyed mallard flank feather or similar, but this probably isn't that important. I've used just the olive thread, no dubbing, over the feather to get a skinny abdomen, which is what I want, and have left the barred feather that I used for the tail attached approximately 1/3 of the way back from the eye. Here I've folded and tied back the barred feather, which will become the wing case. I put dubbing on the thread for the thorax. I like a little sparkle in my gray dubbing, but I'm not sure that it makes a difference. Sometimes I use superfine gray dubbing also. Keep the dubbing reasonably tight and wind an oversized thorax. I feel the oversized thorax helps represent the gas that is swelling the thorax just before it splits open to allow the wings to unfold. Obviously, I don't really know what the trout think, but I, like most fly fishermen, like to feel we know why a fish is taking one fly rather than another, and the oversized thorax does seem to make a difference. So anyway, that's my explanation of what the oversized thorax means. Once you're comfortable with the size of the thorax, fold the wing case over the top of the thorax. Tie it off at the eye of the hook. Cut the excess and then whip finish. It's a simple fly to tie and very effective. The WD-40 has multiple advantages and only the usual disadvantage. Again, this is my favorite dropper during a blue-winged olive emergence. I either start with this as a dropper or quickly add it as a dropper if I'm not getting strikes with one of my late-stage emergers that we tied in Part 4. I'll take the surface fly off and fish this early stage emerger as a single fly if most of the trout are taking this rather than the surface fly, and this is quite common. Often this is the case, especially in flat water. The loop wing emerger is just a slightly later stage than the WD-40 as the wings are now breaking out of the thorax. It is also easy to tie. Again, I tied this on a curved hook, but I suspect a straight hook would be fine. Here I've already put on a tail of a barred feather like a mallard flank or substitute, and my olive thread. My skinny abdomen ends about 1/3 of the way back from the eye. While this looks white here, I've added a gray poly wing tied facing back and started my gray dubbing on the thorax. Again, I like a little sparkle, but I've tried thorax dubbing both with and without sparkle, and I can't say that there's a definite difference. After winding on the thorax, slightly smaller than what we put on the WD-40, because the wing is starting to break out now, I fold the poly wing forward, leaving a small loop and then I put on a few thread wraps. I don't pull it tight at this point because the size of the loop can be adjusted by pulling on the poly to make it smaller, or using a bodkin or a needle of some sort in the loop and pulling on it to make it larger. I'm not sure that this needs to be very precise. Do what looks good to you. Once the size is adjusted, I tie off with some tight wraps, cut the excess wing, and whip finish. This is one of my fishing buddy's favorites. He commonly uses this while I'm using the WD-40. He does often catch more fish, but then he's a better fisherman than I am, so I'm not sure that it's the fly. But sometimes I'll use this fly also. So now we have our emergers. We're almost ready to start fishing, but we still need a cripple and or stillborn pattern. But why? Well, the smaller the mayfly and the flatter the water, which means more surface tension for the small flies to break through, the more likely there will be cripples and stillborns. These are very vulnerable, and trout know that. In fact, let's add another rule of thumb. You've already seen rules of thumb 1, 2, and 3. Number 4 is that if you're getting refusals, especially on flat water with small mayflies, consider fishing cripples or stillborn patterns. Soft hackles are often adequate for cripples and stillborns, so let's tie a soft hackle. The soft hackle is an old traditional fly that doesn't get the respect it deserves. The only real problem with tying small soft hackles is getting the hackle fibers an appropriate length for the tiny hooks. Usually the soft hackle feathers I can find are far too large for classical wrapping, so I use a distribution wrap. I have shown the distribution wrap in a previous series, but it is important and worth repeating here. Here I've started a soft hackle with an olive thread abdomen and a gray thorax. The thorax should be closer to normal size, not the oversized thoraces that we used in our emergers. Sometimes I use a shuck, which seems logical to me, but it hasn't seemed to make a difference to the fish, so most of the time I do skip it. There are multiple techniques for a distribution wrap, but the easiest is to cut the stem of your hackle near the tip, creating a V. The best hackles are straight across the top, but even rounded hackles like this one work. Pull the fibers from both sides of the V together, but try to keep a vertical arrangement. I put the fibers on the far side, aligning the top edge with the top of the hook shank, but some prefer putting the fibers on the near side. Pinching as tight as I can, I use the thread tension to distribute the fibers around the hook. Check the distribution, and if it's correct, cut off the excess hackle, put on a small head, and whip finish. The soft hackle, as I said before, is a greatly underused fly. It can represent a cripple, a stillborn. It can also represent an emerger, and maybe sometimes just something that's edible. When my surface late-stage emerger isn't working during a blue-winged olive hatch, my biggest question is, what do I try first as a dropper? Usually I'll put on one of the emergers we just tied, but I think a soft hackle would also be a reasonable choice. I will quickly change to the other fly if the first choice isn't working. Each hatch may be different for reasons known only to the trout. So I have my flies tied and I'm ready to fish a blue-winged olive emergence. Should you use the same flies? Well, maybe and maybe not. There are likely hundreds of patterns for this hatch, and some may work better than my favorite patterns. The classical Adams, in appropriate sizes, has been used for numerous years for a blue-winged olive hatch and is excellent. The parachute Adams, I think, is even better than the classical Adams, especially on flat water. I'm usually carrying pheasant-tail nymphs in sizes 16 to 22, and a floating pheasant-tail nymph is sometimes a great early merger, which I could use instead of my WD-40. Fly shops are happy to sell you the current local favorites, and they are favorites because they work. You may already have your favorite pattern, and maybe there's a fisherman that's doing well on your water doing a blue-winged olive emergence, and he'd be happy to share with you his or her favorite pattern. Anyway, another rule of thumb that applies to all fishing, I think this is our rule number 5, is to use patterns that you have confidence in. You fish better and more intently with a fly that you trust, so of course you catch more fish. I have confidence in my pattern, but use your own favorites. Just be sure to have a surface fly or flies, emergers, and stillborn or cripple patterns for the various water types. We're finally ready to fish, so let's take a closer look at the blue-winged olive emergence. Even within a species and stream, the blue-winged olive emergence hatches may vary from very sparse to a super hatch proportion. You might not even notice the extremely sparse emergences, as you may not see rising fish. Perhaps you'll only see the swallows swooping and taking flies to let you know an emergence is happening. You may be fishing it as a hatch only because you fished a good emergence at the same time the day before, so you're expecting a hatch. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next part of this series. Fishing the moderately sparse to somewhat heavy hatches are usually the easiest, as there's plenty of rising fish. The super hatches are often hard to fish, as while there's lots of rising fish, they're taking only a few of the numerous naturals present. Catching a trout may be a numbers game then, just like fishing the trico spinnerfall was in part 3. Some think that a little flash on your fly may act as a super trigger during super hatches, but I'm not convinced. You can also miss a good blue-winged olive emergence, especially if it's at the same time as the emergence of a larger mayfly. So if you're fishing a larger mayfly pattern and not doing any good, check the water carefully. Trout seem to like the taste of blue-winged olives or something, and blue-winged olives may be more numerous than the mayfly you're fishing. You sure would hate to miss a blue-winged olive emergence hatch because they're just too much fun to fish. We'll talk about the blue-winged olive nymph, which may be active in the next part of this series, but the patterns that we're using for this emergence are not active. Yes, the emergers and the cripples may quiver or move slightly, but generally you should try to fish the emergence patterns dead drift. So long, thin tippets are in order. I usually start with a 3-foot 6X tippet for most of the common-sized blue-winged olive emergences. You should use slackline casts. Quartering upstream casts will usually be adequate in riffles and occasionally in flat water also. But in flat water, you may do better with a quartering downstream, perhaps adding a wiggle or a reach to the cast, like we did when fishing the trico spinnerfall. You can usually avoid fishing directly downstream by positioning, but when you need to, I especially like the downstream reach cast. Except with extremely sparse hatches, where to fish is obvious, as there are rising fish, but you must still consider the water type when choosing your fly. You may even have to change flies between a minimal riffle and flat water, but I'd start with my flat water flies on this section of a stream in spite of the presence of a minimal riffle focally. When fishing a strong riffle with small pockets, I commonly start with the sparkle dun. In fact, I'd start with a slightly larger fly than the natural for better hookups, but I would quickly switch to the correct size if getting refusals. I'd quickly add a WD-40 merger if I'm still having trouble getting strikes, and if even that doesn't work, I'd change to the quad with or without the WD-40 and even consider adding a soft hackle. If I've been fishing a riffle, I may not bother to change flies when moving to flat water until needed, and rarely I may even start with the sparkle dun on flat water, particularly early in the season. but especially with the smaller blue-winged olives, I'm more likely to start with the simple wrap and add a WD-40 dropper quickly, or even start with both. If the trout clearly favor one fly over the other, I'll remove the other fly and fish with a single fly. I'll try the quad also and add the soft hackle dropper quickly if nothing else seems to work. If it's rainy or windy, disturbing the otherwise flat water surface, I'll likely fish it like a riffle, but if there isn't much surface disturbance, I'd likely fish it like flat water. No matter what the weather is like, what the water is like, or what flies you're fishing, if there's lots of rising fish, active fish, and you're not getting strikes, something needs to change. Take a moment to observe and see what's happening and try to make a thoughtful change. It may be your positioning or casting. It may be the tippet you're using is too short or too thick. It may be your choice of flies, particularly size, but other factors may enter in. But change something. I'll usually give a new change about 10 to 15 minutes during an active emergence before I'll change again if there is no improvement. Fishing a blue-winged olive emergence during a dense superhatch may be very frustrating, and sometimes you just won't get it right. You may want to try a nymph below, as we'll talk about in the next part of this series. I personally don't like putting on a streamer and going below the hatch, but some fishermen do this, and it is successful. If you're not having any luck at all, you can certainly try it. It's a change and sometimes does work, but it just isn't as much fun as fishing on or near the surface during an emergence hatch. Before we can leave blue-winged olives, we still have some unfinished topics. Blue-winged olives also have pre-emergence hatches and post-emergence hatches, including one type of post-emergent hatch or egg-laying that is unique to some species of blue-winged olives. We'll also need to talk about other mayflies that have surface emergence hatches similar to the blue-winged olives, and maybe more importantly, what mayflies don't have similar surface emergences. So, join us for part 6 of Fly Fishing Hatches. I'm Raj Kletke, and I'll see you soon.